In October 1944, as the streets of Aachen shook under the weight of American artillery, the German defenders inside the bunkers along the western edge of the city still believed their positions were unbreakable. They had survived high explosive shells, tank fire, and days of close-quarter combat inside shattered buildings. Their pillboxes were built of reinforced concrete, 2 to 3 layers thick, designed to resist everything short of a direct hit from heavy siege guns. To the officers of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, these fortifications were the last real shield before the Allies crossed deeper into the German heartland. But on the fog-filled mornings of the battle, a new kind of round began falling among the rubble and trenches. At first, the Germans thought they were smoke rounds fired to blind machine gun nests before infantry advanced. White clouds blossomed across intersections, floated down alleys, and slipped between the ruined walls. Yet within seconds, something felt wrong. The smoke did not drift like ordinary smoke. It fell, it clung, and then it ignited with a violent orange-white glare that turned the air itself into a burning haze. The first teams to experience it were the crews inside a pair of MG-42 positions near the city's western railway line. Their bunker had a narrow firing slit, no wider than a few centimeters, and the men inside believed nothing could penetrate it. But when a shell burst outside the front wall, a spray of burning fragments slid through the opening and landed on sandbags and the wooden ammunition crates stored beneath the gun. What followed stunned even veteran soldiers. The fragments did not go out, they burned hotter. They crawled across the fabric of the gunner's parka, melting holes through wool and cotton. One soldier tried beating out the sparks with his glove, only to find the glove catching fire. Another poured his canteen over the glowing spots, only to watch the flames flare brighter when water touched them. Panic spread through the bunker as smoke filled the enclosed space, making every breath feel like inhaling dust mixed with fire. Outside, American infantry were advancing, using white phosphorus grenades and mortar shells to dislodge defenders from fortified corners. To them, these rounds were a tool meant to blind and break resistance in narrow urban terrain. But to the Germans inside those bunkers, it felt like facing a weapon that ignored every rule of fortification design. One squad leader later wrote in his report that the smoke was alive, burning through cloth, wood, and rubber as though it hunted for air. By midday, several bunkers around the Aachen outskirts had been abandoned, not because their walls had failed, but because the air inside had become impossible to survive. In one case, at the Lausberg slope, a group of German sappers attempting to reinforce a damaged machine gun nest found the interior glowing with tiny fires despite there being no structural breach. The WP had entered through a ventilation pipe no wider than a thumb. When they tried sealing it with rags, the rags ignited instantly, filling the chamber with more choking fumes. Descriptions from German field notes revealed genuine confusion. They wrote that the substance burned even when buried under soil, glowing like embers in a forge, refusing to die unless completely deprived of oxygen. Sandbags placed to block the slit windows caught fire where WP had splashed onto their seams, turning the bunker's own defensive materials into fuel. More alarming was the psychological effect. Hardened veterans who had served on the Eastern Front found themselves fleeing rooms that were structurally intact because the heat, light, and choking vapors overwhelmed their nerves in seconds. The fear traveled through the ranks faster than the flames. Many believed the Americans had introduced a chemical agent, though technically WP was not classified as one. But classification meant nothing to the men in the smoke. They only knew that their bunkers, the same bunkers designed to hold off the strongest artillery, had become traps when this new burning smoke seeped inside. Later that evening, as surviving defenders regrouped near the church district, they delivered their first formal reports upward through the chain of command. They described a weapon that behaved unlike any they had prepared for, one that slipped through cracks and vents and seams, one that turned the air inside a fortified position into something that attacked the lungs, eyes, and skin. A sergeant wrote that the substance did not burn like fuel, but rather like a living ash that refused to die. These early battlefield accounts formed the foundation for what German engineers would soon attempt to analyze. But in the opening days of Aachen, the soldiers on the line understood one thing long before their scientists did. Their fortifications were no longer safe. A weapon that looked like smoke had turned their strongest defenses into cages. And for the first time since the war began, the German defenders felt that the enemy had found a way to bypass not just their walls, but the very idea of shelter itself. By the autumn of 1944, the ancient ring of forts surrounding the French city of Metz stood as one of the toughest defensive networks remaining in German hands. Built during the age of the Kaiser and strengthened again by the Wehrmacht, the forts were an interconnected system of tunnels, armored observation posts, and reinforced bunkers buried beneath layers of earth and concrete. German commanders believed Metz was different from Aachen. These positions were not urban shelters hastily reinforced with sandbags. These were cold stone fortresses designed to withstand siege guns and poison gas during the First World War. If any place on the Western Front could stand firm, it was Metz. But when American forces began their push in November, something unexpected unfolded. The first white phosphorus strikes fell along the slopes leading to Fort Jeanne d'Arc, Fort Driant, and the smaller pillboxes scattered between them. At first, the German defenders assumed the glowing bursts were simply smoke intended to cover American assault teams. Within minutes, they realized this was something far more dangerous. WP shells burst high above the trenches, scattering streaks of burning material that stuck to the rooftops of bunkers and the soil around the firing pits. Normally, fire on the surface meant little to the men inside the thick concrete walls, but the defenders soon discovered a flaw in the old Imperial-era designs. Rain channels, vents, and communication shafts, all crafted to help the forts breathe, became pathways for the burning smoke to seep downward. At one fortified entrance near Fort Driant, WP fragments slid into a trench and drifted into an access tunnel, where they continued to glow, feeding on oxygen and the dust in the air. The moment soldiers tried smothering them with earth, the fragments vanished under the dirt, only to flare bright again seconds later. These small bursts did not threaten to crack the concrete, but they did something worse. They filled enclosed spaces with choking fumes and blinding white glare, turning airtight chambers into suffocating ovens. One young officer in the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division described how a bunker that had survived a direct hit from a 155mm American shell was emptied in less than a minute after WP drifted in through a slit meant for observation. No structural damage, no breach, no collapse. Simply the air turned hostile and the men inside fled for their lives. American infantry and artillery crews did not know the full extent of the chaos they were causing. They used WP as a standard tool to blind enemy strongpoints before advancing. But Metz, with its labyrinth of interconnected galleries, responded differently. WP did not merely blind the forts, it infiltrated them. It crawled under doors and around corners, drifting along air currents in spaces never meant to carry flames. German engineers arrived after the first assaults to inspect the damage. They expected to find scorched walls and shattered firing slits. Instead, they found something more unsettling. On one bunker roof, WP had melted its way into a thin seam between layers of concrete. It had not penetrated far, but it had burned hot enough to make the surface crackle and emit a chemical stench that lingered even after the flame died. In another fort, they discovered that WP fragments had slid into drainage gutters and continued burning under a shallow stream of water, creating a ghostly white smoke that rolled through an entire hallway. Water meant for extinguishing fires instead fed the reaction, trapping defenders in corridors filled with dense, acrid haze. Reports from the engineers described WP behaving unpredictably, shining through layers of dust, clinging to the stitching of cloth hanging from pegs, igniting cork insulation along a wall panel. It did not burn like a normal incendiary. It behaved like a creeping vapor that turned anything it touched into fuel. When German commanders realized the forts were being compromised not by explosives but by air contamination, their confidence cracked. Fallback orders were issued not because the walls had failed, but because visibility inside firing chambers had vanished, and the choking smell made it impossible to breathe. At Fort Verdun, a group of 7 defenders abandoned their casement after WP seeped into the air intake shaft despite all attempts to seal it. They wrote that the smoke was blinding, luminous, and filled with tiny sparks that floated like embers refusing to burn out even after several minutes. American troops advancing between the forts noticed that several positions fell silent long before they reached them.
They could not understand why bunkers built to withstand high explosives were being surrendered without prolonged firefights. Only later did intelligence teams realize that WP had nullified the fort's greatest strength, their ability to protect men inside thick concrete. The psychological effect became clear in the captured reports. German soldiers described WP as a force that attacked from every direction, crawling across stone, glowing through cracks, and turning the air inside a fortress into a weapon. One report stated simply that the enemy had found a way to strike inside walls without breaking them. Engineers back in German headquarters examined samples taken from Metz. They found WP residue fused into wood fibers and soil layers, proving it continued burning until its oxygen supply was exhausted. They documented WP smoke flowing through gaps only millimeters wide. Their conclusion was grim. The forts of Metz designed to withstand artillery could not withstand this. Their defensive design philosophy built on thick layers of concrete had been outmatched by a substance that ignored thickness entirely. When the Americans finally secured Metz at the end of November, they did so not by smashing the forts into rubble, but by forcing the defenders to abandon them one choking room at a time. White phosphorus had revealed a truth Germany had not expected. A fortress did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. Its defenders simply needed to be driven from the air they breathed.
In the weeks after Aachen and Metz fell silent with the sound of retreating German boots, a different kind of battle began far from the front lines. Deep inside a commandeered schoolhouse outside Saarbrücken, German engineers convened to study the mysterious substance that had undone two of their most trusted defensive systems. They arrived with samples of burned wood, cracked concrete, and sandbags scorched from the inside. What they sought was an explanation. What they found was a threat no fortification design could counter. On the first morning of their investigation, they placed a charred plank recovered from a bunker near Aachen onto a steel table. The surface was blackened, but the engineers noted a strange pattern, thin white crystals embedded in the grain. When they exposed the plank to a warm draft of air, the crystals flickered back into life, glowing with a faint yellow flame. The plank itself did not ignite. The substance burned alone, as if feeding on the air rather than the wood. The engineers stepped back in shock. They had just seen white phosphorus reignite without any external spark. They realized at once this was no ordinary incendiary. This was a chemical that clung to material, waited for oxygen, and then came alive again. Their next experiment focused on soil samples taken near Fort Driant. They poured the earth into a shallow tray and noted the presence of small hardened lumps, the remnants of WP fragments. When they stirred the soil, a thin trail of smoke rose from within. The lumps glowed faintly, buried under the dirt. WP burned even when smothered. It burned until starved completely of oxygen, and when air returned, the fire returned with it. The engineers recorded these findings with growing discomfort. Thick layers of soil were supposed to suffocate any flame, yet WP ignored this principle entirely. Then they turned to the most important test of all, airflow. They cut a narrow slit, 2 centimeters wide, into a wooden box meant to replicate the narrow openings of German pillboxes. They placed a small WP-coated fragment outside the slit and watched as smoke drifted inward. Within moments, glowing particles followed the smoke, slipping through the tiny opening and landing on the fabric lining inside the box. The cloth caught immediately, not with a roaring blaze, but with a creeping white glow that intensified as more air entered. The engineers stared in silence. Their forts had dozens of vents, each larger than the slit they had just tested. That meant every bunker, every casement, every firing chamber built by the Wehrmacht was vulnerable. The next series of tests focused on materials used in field fortifications. They pressed WP fragments against sandbags, noting how the flame burrowed into the seams where cotton stitching met tightly packed earth. The bags began smoldering from within, proving that the very materials designed to stop bullets and shrapnel became fuel when touched by WP. Rubber gas mask filters ignited instantly. Leather gloves smoked and curled. Even damp wood burned sluggishly under WP heat. The engineers realized that the Americans had found a weapon
that turned the most common defensive materials into liabilities. The more samples the engineers tested, the clearer the danger became. WP did not behave like a normal fire. It crawled. It spread in thin glowing films across surfaces. When a piece fell extinguished, it was only resting. The moment oxygen flowed, it awakened again. The engineers documented every reaction meticulously, but their notes began to read less like scientific observation and more like reports of a threat they could not contain. Several officers from the West Wall Inspection Corps arrived to observe the tests. They asked the engineers whether the forts could be sealed fully against WP. The answer was immediate and bleak. No. Airflow was essential in any sealed position. Without vents, soldiers would suffocate long before an attack even began. With vents, WP would always find a path inside. A simple opening a few centimeters wide was enough to allow deadly smoke to drift in. One officer attempted a hypothetical scenario. Could they design a fortification with isolated air filtration units, like those used in gas attack preparations during the First World War? The engineers reminded him that WP did not act like gas. It was not a vapor to be filtered by charcoal or mechanical pumps. It rode on sparks and fragments in burning dust. Filtration units could not prevent glowing particles from entering through cracks or being blasted into openings by shock waves. Another officer asked whether increasing the thickness of concrete would help. The engineers shook their heads. WP did not defeat concrete by breaking it. It defeated concrete by going around it, by slipping into the smallest gaps without ever needing to breach the walls. It bypassed the very concept of fortification. That was when the head of the engineering team presented the findings from their comparison analysis between Aachen and Metz. He laid out a single sheet of paper at the center of the table. On it were the words copied directly from a German bunker logbook recovered near Aachen. This is not ordinary smoke. It is an enemy of the air itself. The engineers realized the soldiers on the front understood the reality immediately. WP made the air inside a bunker deadly. Blocking it out entirely was impossible. Airflow was the weakness, and no fortification could exist without airflow. Their final report, written in precise and clinical language, delivered a conclusion that spread dread through every officer who read it. No static defensive structure, regardless of thickness, can offer reliable protection against white phosphorus penetration. The American weapon nullifies enclosed fighting positions by rendering interior air hazardous and by igniting interior materials through microscopic points of entry. In simple words, the Germans wrote what they already knew. Nothing could seal WP out. A fortification did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. All that was required was a single breath of air carrying the burning fragments inside. WP had rewritten the rules of defensive warfare, and the engineers could find no countermeasure in time to stop it.
By late 1944, as German engineers submitted their grimmest estimates, a deeper realization began to spread through the command structure. The core of German defensive doctrine, the belief that concrete could hold the line, had begun to crumble. From the West Wall to the outer rings of defenses near Saarlautern, every fortification built on the principle of layered concrete, hardened firing slits, and interlocking bunkers faced the same truth. White phosphorus had turned the strongest defensive idea of the Wehrmacht into a trap. For more than 2 decades, Germany had invested heavily in fortified positions. The lessons of the First World War had taught them that men behind concrete could endure artillery shelling that would annihilate exposed infantry. The construction of the West Wall and fortified zones along the Siegfried Line reflected that philosophy. Engineers believed a bunker was not merely a shelter, but a strategic multiplier. One machine gun team protected by reinforced concrete could hold back entire companies of attackers. But the encounters at Aachen and Metz shattered that assumption. The problem was not that the concrete failed. The problem was that the fortifications relied on the assumption that attackers could not influence the air inside. WP changed that. The first high-level meetings addressing this threat took place in a bunker near Koblenz. Senior officers gathered around a map showing the distribution of defensive positions stretching across the western frontier. Several wanted to reinforce vulnerable forts with additional outer walls or steel shielding, but the engineers countered quickly. Additional layers would not matter if the vents and firing slits remained. A bunker without airflow was a tomb. A bunker with airflow was vulnerable. That reality shook the room. Officers responsible for organizing the defense of Saarlautern and the approaches to the Rhine began questioning whether they should even hold their fortifications or pull back to mobile defensive lines. One general argued that abandoning concrete positions without a fight would break morale and signal collapse. But others pointed out that attempted defense inside WP-soaked bunkers did the same. The men feared the smoke more than enemy infantry. Soldiers talked about it in the trenches. They whispered that the new American rounds crawled through cracks the way gas had crawled across no man's land in 1916. Rumors spread that no mask or filter could stop the burning smoke. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories revealed a truth commanders could not ignore. The psychological effect of WP was greater than the physical damage. Reports from the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division described machine gun teams abandoning bunkers that were structurally intact simply because WP fumes had begun drifting inside. Some ran out blinded and gasping, only to be cut down by advancing American troops. Others refused orders to return to their stations, claiming they would rather face small arms fire than choke in a burning chamber. For decades, German defensive doctrine insisted that infantry must fight from hardened positions to conserve manpower and maximize firepower. But WP had reversed the logic. The safest place for an American soldier was outside a German bunker. The most dangerous place for a German soldier was inside it. German engineers attempted to propose solutions. One idea was building a new type of bunker modeled after submarine compartments using airtight steel doors and internal ventilation systems. But such a design would take months to construct and required steel the Reich no longer possessed in sufficient supply. Another suggestion involved using water-filled troughs inside bunkers to create humidity that would prevent WP from igniting. Tests proved this ineffective. WP burned underwater, and the added moisture made the fumes thicker. Additional material shortages made such proposals unrealistic. Field commanders requested portable filtration units based on gas masks to protect crews inside bunkers. But engineers warned that filtration systems could not stop glowing particles and would fail as soon as vents filled with burning residue. Even if the filters worked for a few minutes, the smoke would eventually overwhelm the sealed space, making it impossible to remain inside. Meanwhile, American forces continued to use WP in combined arms tactics. A common maneuver observed by German intelligence followed a simple pattern. American mortars fired WP rounds to blind a bunker. The smoke forced defenders to close their firing slits or abandon their guns. Once the position went silent, American infantry moved in, often supported by bazooka teams or flamethrowers. By the time the next wave of WP landed, the defenders had already withdrawn or been forced out into the open, where machine gun fire or artillery completed the attack. The sequence repeated from Aachen to Metz to the outskirts of Saarlautern. The Germans found themselves unable to adapt. The entire philosophy behind a pillbox assumed the interior was a place of safety, where men could survive the worst bombardment. White phosphorus turned that assumption inside out. The more they relied on bunkers, the more vulnerable their troops became. This shift triggered heated debate within German high command. Some officers argued that fortifications should still be used to slow the American positions. Others claimed they should be abandoned entirely to avoid unnecessary losses. But logistics left them no choice. Retreating meant surrendering prepared positions and facing the enemy in open terrain with fewer resources. Holding meant trapping soldiers in structures that could not defend them from WP. At one meeting, a frustrated colonel asked if any bunker anywhere on the Western Front could resist WP attacks long enough to maintain a stable defensive line. The engineers answered with a single word: no. That word carried the weight of a collapsing doctrine. Without reliable fortifications, the Germans had to turn to mobile defense. But by late 1944, they lacked the manpower, fuel, and artillery to execute it effectively. Their defensive strength had always depended on buying time behind concrete. Now concrete no longer bought time, it cost it. As the Americans continued their advance, German commanders recognized a grim truth. Their fortifications did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were designed for a kind of war that no longer existed. WP had rewritten the battlefield. And the pillbox philosophy, long the backbone of German defense, was now nothing more than an illusion.
By the winter of 1944, the German army had learned the physical properties of white phosphorus, its ability to burn wherever oxygen reached it, its persistence in soil, its tendency to reignite, and its uncanny way of slipping through gaps no wider than a finger. But the numbers and diagrams inside engineering reports did not convey the full truth. What broke the German defensive system was not only the chemical nature of WP, it was the fear, a silent fear that moved faster than any American infantry company and spread farther than any artillery barrage. The men on the front felt it first, long before the scientists confirmed it. Word traveled from Aachen to Metz and echoed through the West Wall. Stories whispered in trenches became the unofficial doctrine of the German soldier. They said the new rounds burned through clothing like acid. They said the smoke was alive, searching for any place to cling. They said the Americans used it not to kill, but to flush men from their shelters like smoke driving rats from a tunnel. Even officers who tried to correct exaggerations found themselves unable to counter what their men had seen with their own eyes. The fear took root because the weapon did not behave like anything they had trained against. High explosive shells announced themselves with thunder. Napalm roared. Flamethrowers gave off the scream of pressurized fuel, but WP approached quietly. The first sign was a burst of white light. Then, glowing fragments drifting like sparks from a bonfire, landing on helmets, sandbags, and sleeves. And then the air turned to poison. At Forgenark, a German machine gunner recalled the moment his bunker filled with the pale smoke. He said it came in thin threads at first, like morning fog. Then there was a glow inside the room, even though no lamp was lit. When he lifted his sleeve, he saw tiny stars clinging to the fabric, burning without flame. He tried wiping them off, but the heat bit into his hand. He said the worst part was the smell, something sharp and chemical that clawed at the throat. Within seconds, the men inside the bunker stumbled out, choking, tears streaming from their eyes, only to be met by American rifle fire waiting beyond the doorway. Scenes like this repeated across every fortified line the Germans tried to hold. WP turned defensive positions into traps. Worse, it made every man inside a bunker question the safety of the very structures meant to protect him. German psychologists working with frontline units reported a rise in panic reactions among troops assigned to bunker duty. Men volunteered to serve in open trench lines rather than sealed chambers. Some refused to re-enter positions that had been hit just once by WP mortar rounds, claiming they would rather face artillery shrapnel in the open than choke in the darkness of a sealed pullbox. Commanders attempted to enforce discipline, but fear could not be punished out of existence. At Saralauten, a lieutenant recorded that his men begged him not to assign them to a casemate recently hit by WP mortar rounds. He entered himself to prove it was safe. But within minutes, the lingering residue burned his eyes and throat. He retreated gasping and said nothing more about duty assignments. WP had done something artillery and tanks never could. It broke the psychological bond between German soldiers and their fortifications. For decades, German training had emphasized that, to survive battle, one must trust the bunker. A bunker could stop bullets, shells, and fire. It was a fortress, a refuge. But now soldiers saw it differently. A bunker had become a place where death seeped in without warning, carried by smoke too thick to breathe and flames too small to see until they were already burning. American commanders rarely spoke publicly about WP. It was known among infantry as a tool for screening movement, marking targets, and forcing defenders out of strongpoints, but it was not celebrated. It did not appear in propaganda posters or war bond advertisements. It was a quiet weapon, used without fanfare. Yet on the German side, it took on an almost mythical quality. Captured soldiers told interrogators that WP was more feared than the flamethrower. One prisoner, near the Saar, confessed that every time American mortar fire began, he prayed not for survival, but simply that the shells were high explosive rather than the white ones. German officers read the engineering reports and understood the enemy had found a formula that no thickness of concrete could resist. They realized WP changed the rules of defensive warfare. It made the interior of a bunker more dangerous than the exterior. It neutralized machine gun nests without direct assault. It forced retreat even when the position was intact. No wonder morale fractured. By early 1945, as the Americans pushed toward the Rhine, German fortifications fell in rapid succession. Many were abandoned with ammunition still stacked neatly inside. Others were taken without a shot fired because the defenders had fled the moment WP smoke touched their air vents. Some bunkers did attempt to resist. Soldiers used wet blankets to seal cracks. They packed earth against firing slits. They tried to create airtight chambers. But WP did not need wide openings. A hairline gap was enough. Smoke would seep in, glowing particles drifting behind it. The defenders knew the moment they saw the first faint spark on a sandbag that their time was running out. One German captain later wrote that WP turned every enclosed space into a clock counting down to suffocation. The Americans never intended WP to become a psychological terror weapon. It was simply one tool among many in their arsenal. But on the German side, its effect went far beyond physical injury. It undermined confidence. It stripped away the sense of safety that defensive warfare depended on. When the German High Command reviewed the final engineering summaries, they found no solutions, only warnings. The forts could not be sealed, the bunkers could not be defended, the vents could not be redesigned, the materials could not resist the chemical reaction, and the soldiers could not overcome the fear. WP had revealed a truth that no report needed to underline. Germany's fortifications were relics of an older war, one fought with shells that shattered walls and gas that could be blocked by masks. But this was a new war, one where flame did not need to roar to kill and smoke did not need toxins to terrify. As the Americans advanced deeper into Germany, the last fortified lines crumbled, not because they were outgunned, but because a weapon the Americans barely advertised had eroded the will to stay inside them. White phosphorus did not break Germany's walls. It broke Germany's faith in its walls. And once that faith was gone, no amount of concrete could save them.